Hello, Brian Beneduce coming to you again. We are on chapter 8. This is a long chapter, powerful again, and it is titled Guilt, so I'm going to get right into it. If I make a mistake, please, I apologize beforehand. I'm not going to go back and start over. Guilt. Guilt is a cancer. Guilt will confine you, torture you, destroy you. It's a black wall. It's a thief. Dave Grohl. Guilt. Wow, talk about a strong emotion. Unworthy, unsure, not good enough, worry, shame. As a young boy, all I ever wanted to do was make my parents proud. It was what I lived for. But I never did believe I was ever good enough or worthy of receiving that pride. But I must make it very, very clear that this severe guilt trip was not the result of something they said to me, how I was treated, or some unfair expectation that they had created. Quite contrary, they are great parents. The source of this profound guilt was created entirely inside my own mind. Deep feelings of guilt are a significant part of understanding agoraphobia. Guilt is inescapably connected and serves as a catalyst that deepens and enhances fear and anxiety. And because of this, I exist inside a world where I am able to feel guilty about almost every little thing. No matter how much money I make or what I achieve in life, to this day, I still can't shake all that guilt. I can become envious, jealous, and downright angry when I see or hear happy people enjoying themselves. I have wealth, a wonderful wife, and 2 great kids, and I often can't feel happy about it. It's hard for me to live in the now and enjoy myself. Why should I feel guilty? I might be out for a drive in my new sports car or out on my boat in Narragansett Bay, and I will innately take inventory of my family. What is my son doing? Does he need my help? Where is my daughter? Is she okay? If my wife is home worrying about them, then why am I here? What right do I have enjoying myself when they need my help? Maybe I should be making more money right now instead of trying to relax. Shame on me. Even with the success I have had pruning back my personal anxiety tree, the guilt branches are the longest, thickest, and most thorny. They are branches that started growing when I was too young to understand them and too young to do anything about them. When I was young, I once remember sitting in the back of our car on a vacation with the whole family in upstate New York. It was late, sometime around 11 o'clock. My mother, sister, and brother were all sound asleep as my dad drove up and down the street looking for a decent motel. He would slow the car, squint at the neon, no vacancy sign, groan, then quickly drive on. He repeated this little routine over and over, and it seemed like there wasn't a single motel in the town where we would be able to check in that night. I sat in the middle of the back seat with my feet on the wheel, well hung, and my knees planted under my chin, feeding on this mounting frustration, my anxiety rising little by little, moment by moment, until I was a complete mess. I didn't show it, but I was completely in tune to my father's anxiety, and I could sense his frustrations growing in my own mind and body like a cancer. I stared through the windshield and kept my eyes as wide open as I could, feeling I had a personal responsibility to help our family find a safe place to stay, and I was failing miserably. It hurt and drove me crazy to watch my father worry about anything. I had to help him. I had to try harder. I had no choice. As I mentioned, my father worked many different jobs when I was little. And if he happened to lose one, I would immediately feel guilty that I hadn't been doing more around the house. I believed I was a burden. How could they be proud of me if I was contributing to my dad's problems? I would feel guilty if my mom served steak for dinner because I knew the household budget was tight. I almost couldn't bear to eat it. When our family went to restaurants, I would scour the menu and make sure I ordered the cheapest dinner. I hated asking my mom for money for anything, even if it was something important like a school trip. And I knew that if she knew any of this, it would hurt her too. But I could not be any more of a burden than I thought I already was under any circumstances. I just couldn't do it. That's just the way it was. It was innate. As I mentioned, when we moved from Connecticut to Rhode Island, I was crushed. I cried. I loved my friends, the old neighborhood, and didn't want to move away. It was a very emotional time for every one of us, as you can imagine. It would be from any family. I was impressed that my sister had the guts to insist she'd be allowed to go back to Canaan and graduate from her old high school, Housatonic Valley Regional High, with all her friends. I wanted desperately to ask too, but I couldn't bear the guilt that would have resulted from just posing the question. After all, my father had moved us to a new town to make our lives better. I could not bear to put that added pressure on him. I worked odd jobs throughout my childhood. I remember selling a newspaper called Grit, where I would make $3 or $4 a week. It wasn't much at all, but in my mind, I was contributing something. Excuse me. At a mere 6 years old, I would fetch the mail for our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Howe, and she would give me a quarter. My parents had a Superman bank in their bedroom that was about 2 feet tall, and I watched my dad put his spare change in it every night. When he wasn't around, I would sneak into the bedroom and slip a few of my own quarters through the slot on the top of Superman's head. I don't know if he ever knew. When I was a little older, I tried to continue to work as much as I could. I worked at the local swim club. I took a part-time job at a local wiener joint. I really liked to work and make money, but more important than that, it helped ease my guilt and made me feel like I was contributing. In my mind, I was pitching in, even though my mom and dad would never consider actually using my money. In high school, I worked harder, was paid a little more, and was able to start to save. I worked every day after school that I didn't have sports, and I worked almost every weekend. By then, my parents were providing everything we needed as a family more easily. But I still felt an overwhelming urge to pitch in and help. They refused all my money. It broke my heart, and my guilt didn't subside. In fact, it grew. Often the guilt would become so acute that it would create its own panic attack. Other times the guilt would create a brand of anxiety that would infest my life and feed upon itself for years. By this time, my father had started his own blow molding company called Lubin Plastics. I would help out when I could and learned that I really liked working with my hands on machines. And I really enjoyed working again with my father. In 1979, I graduated high school and I immediately went to work full-time. It wasn't long before Jack, my father's right-hand man and loyal employee, who had worked side by side with him for years, suddenly quit. I always believed he saw my arrival as an insult. He assumed I would be trained to take over the family business one day, and he saw his opportunity for advancement disappear. I don't know why, because I had only worked part-time. At that point in my career, I had no idea what I was doing. I had never been in business for myself. I couldn't repair any blow molding machines, and I didn't know the first thing about sales, except I knew that the salesmen were the guys who always wore nice suits and drove fancy cars. But honestly, I couldn't see ever driving off to some unknown place to meet with strangers and try and get them to buy something from me. Just the thought itself raised my anxiety to uncomfortable levels. I always figured I would end up being a shop mechanic. I expected I would learn all about the blow molding machines, how they operated. I would figure out how to fix them, then someday I would become the shop supervisor. Of course, I had dreams and aspirations of being rich someday, but I had no fathomable idea of how it could possibly happen. Maybe I could invent something, I would think to myself, then people would have to come to me, and I could deal with them on my own turf, where I felt safe, and I would avoid all the panic and all the fear of having to travel to see them. My father may never admit it, but I think he was really pissed that Jack left the company the way he did, and subconsciously he transferred a little of that anger onto me. Jack's sudden departure created a lot more work, and my father had to shoulder nearly the entire workload himself. Being the guilt master I am, I forced myself to work harder and harder, trying to learn as much as I could, as fast as I could. Most, if not all, that happens behind the scenes in a plastics blow molding company is manual labor, and that was something I could understand and do quickly to become useful. We did not have any of those fancy box-making machines in our shop. Instead, the boxes all had to be made by hand. I had to set up the box, put the bottles in the box, tape them up, then stack the boxes on skids. Being in great shape and fresh out of high school, I had a deep reserve of strength and energy, and I dove right in. My usual 9-to-5 shift became more like 7:30 to 6:30. And in such a competitive industry as plastics, the shop needed to run on a 6 or 7 day week, 24-hour operation. Every minute that the machines were down and not churning out new bottles, We were losing opportunities to make money. Jack had been a very good mechanic and a very good supervisor, and I was neither. But I would watch my father diligently, and though we did have fun together at times, most of the time my work life was filled with stress and deepening guilt. My father was a great mechanic in his own right, and had worked on these machines for years. But he didn't know everything about the newer machine he had purchased. The older machines in the shop were breaking down and gradually being replaced by newer models. And though the fancy new machines were more efficient, they included many solid-state components that my father had never seen before. So I took it upon myself to try my best to learn schematics, mechanics, pneumatic pressure, all on my own. Everything associated with running, operating, and maintaining a modern blow molding machine. In my head, I had caused my father's right-hand man and mechanic to quit. I accepted that it was all my fault. I had screwed this up. So it was up to me to make sure nothing ever hindered these machines. No one asked me to, but I made it solely my responsibility. This developed my sense of urgency and heightened my anxiety. I pride myself on being a hard worker. Everywhere I have ever worked, my bosses have said I did a great job, and I am confident I always did. I would always put in extra time and extra effort. Whether it was at the Wiener joint, a gas station, delivering papers, I always wanted to show that I was the guy who was going to give you that little extra. Maybe it was the guilt that drove me. I didn't want to let anybody down. I wondered sometimes if I even deserved my pay. There are 1,000 things that can go wrong with a blow molding machine, and I promise not to bore you with the details about every one of them. But the bottom line is that if you have the right personnel in the right positions, mistakes and breakdowns can be limited, and we, unfortunately, did not. As a new company, we couldn't afford the best help, and in my opinion, many of the employees who worked our second and third shifts just didn't give a shit at all. They would arrive, go through the motions, put in their time, punch out, and then go home. That is, if they happened to show up at all. As a new supervisor, I would stay in charge until the next supervisor arrived. Some nights my relief would show up at 4:30, some nights 5:30, and some nights not at all. Some nights I would be stuck in the shop until midnight, praying the third shift supervisor would come in, and many times he did. Excuse me. With all this time on my hands, I trained myself to become the head mechanic. I learned as much as I could in the job and piled on new responsibilities. Now, it was guaranteed that when anything went wrong, my anxiety, panic, and guilt levels would ascend to astronomical levels. I would own every screw-up. Things couldn't ever go wrong, or I would be letting my family down. Back then, if I took a rare night off and went out on a date, I would carry a beeper. If the beeper went off in the middle of dinner or a movie, and it frequently did, it meant something was wrong on the machine the supervisor could not fix, and we would have to jump in the car and race back to the shop. It would have been easier if I had just called the shop and said I would address it first thing in the morning, but not me, not Mr. Guilt. Instead, I would go to work and leave my date and future wife, Robbie, sleeping in the car until it was time to take her home. I felt incredibly guilty doing that to her. It broke my heart, but I felt more guilty that by not being in the shop when I was needed, I was letting my family down. Then after I took Robbie home, I would end up returning to the shop to finish up. This was not slave labor. Nobody was pointing a gun to my head. No one told me to do it. It was my choice. I took it upon myself because the guilt drove me to it. Once, when I was still in high school, I remember my father coming home one night, exhausted, his blue overalls caked with grease. It killed me to see him look like that. The guilt was overwhelming, and I was the reason, and was the reason I went to work for him in the first place. I was 17 years old with a good head on my shoulders, and I could have gone to college or done anything I wanted, for that matter. But I chose this life, and if I didn't like it, there was nobody to blame for it but me. In society today, everybody seems to like to point fingers when something doesn't go their way, or they don't get what they want. There was only one direction to point the finger, at me. When you finally realize what agoraphobia is all about, you learn it's all up to you. You can choose to get better, or you can slowly sink to its depths. My father had a head sales rep named Marco, who who was in charge of our shop sales. He was cool, good-looking Italian guy with a great suit and a great car. He had confidence and swagger, essentially everything I wanted to have someday. I would pretend to walk around with that swagger, but it was just a show after all. What a joke. Deep down, I had no swagger. I was petrified of everything. In the early 80s, Marco did something horrible and unforgivable. Behind my father's back, he established his own blow molding company. Essentially, he could now manufacture his own bottles and sell them to all the great accounts he had established while working for us. I went crazy. I was absolutely furious. Here he was stealing from my father, taking the food out of my family's mouth. A funny thing about anger fueled by guilt and anxiety, it starts at a level 9. The moment I heard the news, I ran to my car and I said I was going over to his new facility to straighten him out. It was the most angry I've ever been. My father could see the veins popping from my forehead, and I sensed what I was about to do, and he literally ran into the road and jumped in front of my car to stop me. I nearly ran him over. It's important to note here that my anger here was twofold. It wasn't just focused on my belief that he had ripped us off. It was also because I realized what was going to happen next. I would have to be the new salesman. I was too afraid to leave my own room, and now I was going to have to learn and endure the whole list of those things that terrified me the most. There was no greater insult. I hated Marco with every ounce of my soul for what he had just done to me. I promised my father I would let it go, but I simply couldn't. The next day, I drove over to Marco's facility anyway, got up into his face and told him in no uncertain terms that if he stole another piece of business from my family, I would break his neck, and I meant it. I didn't care about the outcome or ramifications. I was just too incensed. As you can imagine, over the next several months, our order board became shorter and shorter as our accounts were instead filled by our new competitor, Marco. My mother and father pretended not to show up, but I could tell they were nervous about all of our futures. But my parents have always been able to live in the moment better than I. I lived with anxiety in the future. I could not sleep at night because I was a complete mess, and because I knew they were worried too. After long sleepless nights and long arguments with my inner demons, I decided I had to try it. I had to try to learn how to become a salesman. The guilt was driving me again, and I would endure it all without telling anybody. Sales at the shop were slowly rebounding and were trickling in, but we were suddenly faced with another unforeseen crisis, the oil embargo. Because of the embargo, we were forced to pay cash in advance for all of our new plastic material, which left the company with zero cash flow. Money became extremely tight, tighter than it ever had been. I would work second and sometimes third shifts at the shop, go home, catch a few hours sleep, slip on a suit, then go out and battle through panic attacks while trying to sell. My father would remain at the shop trying to keep the machines running without me, but over time he couldn't keep up, and it was taking his toll on him and the business. My family business and my father were failing, and here I was, too handcuffed by anxiety and fear to walk into someone's office and ask for a simple order that would save us all. My level of guilt about this had risen off the charts and was practically insurmountable. I would find myself parked on the side of the highway playing the theme from Rocky over and over just to build up enough nerve to drive over the damn George Washington Bridge. My throat would be closing, I would feel dizzy, and water would cascade from my eyes, staining my shirt. Many times I would take the next available exit and head home, fabricating some foolish story about how the customer just didn't want to buy from us that day, or they canceled the appointment. The voices in my head were never more at odds, one side telling me I was worthless and needed to turn north and go back home, while on the other side, the voices were urging me to continue to head south and fight for my family. I had no idea how to deal with this roller coaster of emotions at the time, and it scared me shitless. And I think about what made it worse was that I knew I was becoming a great communicator. I was learning to sell. I enjoyed it, and I was damn good at it. My problem was never about convincing a customer to place the order. It was about just being able to get myself in front of that customer in the first place. If only I could have figured this son of a bitch out. I cried more times on the Connecticut Thruway than I can count. I sat hyperventilating in more hospital parking lots at this time than at any other time in my life. I would often find myself in full-fledged panic mode, cruising through supermarket parking lots, praying for some sort of human interaction, approaching random strangers and creating conversations to calm myself down. I'm sure they thought I was completely insane. God forbid if they would ask if I was okay, because it was so much worse if they noticed. The business was failing and we started to sell off our assets. It was ugly. My dad and I had always been the best of friends until we went to work together. Our relationship became strained, not because we still didn't love each other, but because of the toll all the pressure had placed on both of us. I admit now that today I am happy that Lubin Plastics went out of business. I think it was for the best. My father, my mother, and my brother were all deeply involved in the company and in its demise, and even today our relationships continue to be strained from that terrible experience. By 1989, I had opened a small gym, Champion Sports Gym. Working out had become a very important part of my life. We had to close the shop each year for a week to give employees with tenure vacation time. Between the pressure of the business and fighting to stay afloat, my anxiety tree's branches had now grown tentacles, and they were reaching down to wrap themselves around my throat. To make matters worse, I learned that when I returned to work, that a new Gold's Gym would be opening just 2 miles from my own gym, and this unexpected new competitor happened to be an old friend. I worked for my dad from 1979 until 1991, when the company finally collapsed. Looking back on it now, I can't blame Marco. After all, he did exactly what my father had done. He left a good company to start his own. That's simple capitalism at work. It's the American dream, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. I had considered the guy who opened the competing gym to be a friend. In fact, he was even at my wedding. But again, that's capitalism, that's business, and that can be good. Back then, guilt, fear, anxiety, and panic filled my days, drove me and enslaved me into the industry and a way of life. Oh, and to update you all, I heard that the friend of mine who started the gym has found himself up to his eyeballs in legal problems now. And we learned Marco went out of business just 3 years after he left us. But that's capitalism at work too. I don't feel guilty about that. I'm at 22 minutes. There's too much to talk about here. I might do a separate video essentially on this one chapter. Guilt is still something I live with. I'd like to tell you that it's managed, but it's still there. It's part of the anxiety tree that I've talked about many, many times. And this also touches on sales. When I give my talks, I talk about the sales, and one of the questions that come up, and it's a great question, if you suffered from agoraphobia and you suffered from panic and anxiety, why would you pick sales? And my answer is always the same, because my goals have always been to be very successful. And I was always looking at people that were in sales in my industry. Those are the people that had the fancy cars. They looked as if I've always wanted to look, which is part of my healing thought process. And that's why I got involved in sales. And no matter how hard and how difficult my life was going through this thing that I never knew was agoraphobia, panic and anxiety, I always say, thank God he gave me the will to fight. Even though I learned later on in life, fighting is not the way to do it. But again, that's for later. This is a very, very, once again, I'm sorry, powerful chapter. Maybe I say that all the time because there's not that many chapters, and I tried to get as much as I could in 173 pages. I have to keep this less than 25 minutes because sometimes it doesn't download. So thank you for listening, and please stay tuned. Go to Brian Beneduce's YouTube channel, Beneduce, and look for some more videos. Thank you very much, and have a great day.